Welcome back to the Christianity and Business Podcast, an initiative of the Archie W. Dunham College of Business at Houston Christian University. I'm your host, Darren Shear, and this is the show that helps Christian business leaders to integrate biblical values into business. On this episode, we're joined by Uli Chi. Uli has led for-profit businesses, nonprofit organizations in the Theological Academy, and the local church, gleaning a wealth of wisdom from each. As an award-winning technological entrepreneur, he founded a software company that developed 3D virtual reality software, revolutionizing decision-making for consumers and businesses. And he's currently the board chair of the Virginia Mason Franciscan Health System in the Pacific Northwest. And he also lends his expertise to the advisory boards for the Benaroya, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Is that close enough?
Close enough.
Research Institute and the Virginia Mason Institute, which are both in Seattle, where he lives. And he serves as the vice chair at the Max De Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. And he's been part of his local Presbyterian congregation for over 50 years and has served that community in a wide variety of leadership roles. And he's the author of the new book titled The Wise Leader. Uli, welcome to the Christianity and Business Podcast.
Thanks, Darren, for having me.
Uli, when did you first realize God wanted to be involved in your work in business?
I think it started all the way back when I was in college. I had sort of a bit of an epiphany when I was doing my work I was a math major, but I also took a bunch of computer science classes at the time. This was back in the 1970s, so long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, it seems, from today. But anyway, I remember writing my first piece of code and having this sort of wonder of seeing something, that came out of my mind and became a reality. And it made me wonder if that's sort of how God might have felt in creating something out of nothing. And I sort of had this feeling of participating in God's creative work. And I think that sort of resonance, it struck a deep chord within me that this was something I was meant to do. And so technology became sort of a calling. I think many people have callings to be pastors and missionaries. That's sort of the more traditional model of calling. But I think business and technology was, for me, a place where I found my calling to express God's mission in the world. So.
Did you have at that time people in your life that you respected who were doing faith integration and business well, modeling that for you?
That's a great question, Darren. I think not a lot, but I had some good people in terms of helping me think about that. I know, when I guess I didn't say, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I became a Christian when I was in high school through the Ministry of Young Life, which many of your listeners have heard of. And but I came out of a non-Christian context, and once I heard the gospel, it sort of made sense to me out of life and gave purpose and meaning to life for me. And I became very enthusiastic about the Christian faith. And I remember my mother went to one of my Young Life meetings sort of for parents, and she came up to my Young Life leader and said, my son used to want to be a nuclear physicist. Now he wants to be a pastor. What have you done to him? So that was not good news for her. But anyway, but I think the reason I tell that story is because actually my Young Life leader and some other folks who were wiser and obviously much more mature in the faith than I was, I think had the insight of saying, you can serve God in more than in explicitly Christian vocations, whether it's pastor or whatever. And you're naturally drawn. I was naturally drawn to it because it was such a new and such an important thing to me that I wanted to sort of give my all, right, for Jesus. And what I discovered was that there were other ways to do that. Actually, one of the folks, I joined this church that I've been a part of now for the last almost 50 years, and we had a person named Paul Stevens. I don't know if that name rings a bell to you. Paul was a faculty member at Regent College in Vancouver, and he's written a lot on faith and work integration. And he early on sort of helped ground me into the notion that the marketplace can be a place of ministry rather than just simply a means to an end.
Wow, thank God for the wisdom of those young life leaders to, because I think for a lot of pastors, when they have a congregant come to them and say, I'm really s- feeling a call to ministry, that can kind of be a flattering thing for them. It's like, oh, well, welcome to the club.
Right.
And this is it's sort of I don't know, it's got to be at least somewhat affirming to them that other people want to follow the career path that they took. And when a student is fully trained, he becomes like his teacher, Jesus says. And so a lot of the discipleship that we have going on is not just helping people understand the Christian faith and its applications in all aspects of life, but the natural progression to seminary and then to church planting or and something that's a more traditional form of ministry. But thank God for those young life leaders.
No, exactly. And for many others, I think, I mean, the very work, this podcast you're doing, I think is an example of trying to take both theology and business seriously, right? I mean, to see them as, two part of one single fabric rather than being two different activities. And I think in my generation, I think particularly in the sort of tradition, the Protestant evangelical tradition that I grew up in, there was a strain of sort of dividing the sacred and the secular, right? That spiritual things matter, physical things don't matter. The important thing was getting people to heaven, and sort of what happened here was simply a means to an end or something. And rather than taking that God's creation seriously as He did, right? God created the world for a reason, and we have things that we are intended to do in it, and to fulfill His purpose in it. And I think that's so recovering that actually as a Christian has been a journey of most of my life. And I think, my book, The Wise Leader, is in part born out of that wrestling of trying to figure out how do you live wisely in the world that is incredibly complicated in many ways, and how do you, live faithfully in it.
Yes. I'm gonna ask you some questions about that here in
Sure.
just a minute. Just as we're getting to know you a bit more in your journey, could you share a story of a time when you saw God's hand at work in the marketplace and maybe a business you were involved in?
Yeah, I think, I think, um, at least for me, I think being faithful in the marketplace, I'm not sure this is exactly the answer to your question, so feel free to ask it again. But I think the reality is that being a faithful Christian in the world, I think, is for me about looking at caring for all the people who have been entrusted into our care. I think I created my own business and ran a software business for many years, and rightly, you focus on. There are some people who seem to make more of a difference than others, right? There's certain folks who have a particular sort of outsized contribution to the work. I think one of the things that's distinctive about the Christian vision of life and also as applied to business is that everyone matters. All of us are made in the image of God and have something to contribute. Now, it's appropriate to pay attention to those who seem to make a big difference. But I think where we are distinctively challenged is to be focused on those who perhaps we're not naturally inclined to pay attention to. And so one of the practices that I developed over time was to make sure I was paying attention to those who were on what you might call the fringes of my business, those who are the less seem like they have a lesser role, but they actually have a very important role to fulfill. And I think that was part of seeing God at work in them as well as in sort of the more obvious places.
Mm. Yeah, and what transpired out of that, because there's a lot of well-intentioned companies that are led by all sorts of social agendas out there that are, really trying to make this a big part of their brand. But what was distinctive that really God was getting the glory for this? Um,
Yeah, I think it's that. I mean, it's easy to talk about it. It's another to sort of, you know, put legs behind or substance behind it. I think for me, again, a very practical thing for me, every time we were looking at let's just take a very practical compensation level. We worked hard to well before there was any legislation about, raising minimum wage or anything like that, trying to compensate those who are at the lowest levels in a way that was consistent with their needs in terms of being able to, support their families. Now, admittedly, we were in a business that had the capacity to do that. So if you don't have if you don't have the resources to do that, that's a different issue. But we did. And so we gave a lot of attention to making sure that we were not just treating people fairly, but that we were being generous to those who were on the margins. It was sort of like the gleaning laws in the Old Testament, right? That we wanted to make sure people had enough to live reasonably and well, and to recognize them. And same thing when we were, we had the opportunity, not every company does, but to do bonuses at the end of the year. And we tried to sort of start with those who were not at the top, but at the bottom. And so to take seriously the fact that how we treat the least of these is how, as Jesus would say later or earlier, much earlier, about those who are the least, how we treat them is how we treat Jesus, right? So
yes. And so you've written this book titled The Wise Leader. How should the scriptural truth that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, as it says in Proverbs, how should that impact the way we conduct business?
Yeah, it's a great question, Darren. I think there's a lot to the fear of the Lord. I think sometimes when we hear the word fear, we think about cowering. And there's a sense in which obviously God, who's the creator of the universe, is much bigger and more powerful than we are. So we are right to be in awe and perhaps to have a bit of fear. But I think the fear of the Lord, for me, as I've reflected on it, is recognizing, first of all, that we're not dealing with a thing, but with a person. Right? It's actually, we're called, and we know this, I think, as Christians, that we're called into fundamentally a relationship. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And wisdom, I think sometimes we live in a world that is, in my lifetime, we've seen the explosion of information and knowledge, right? We know far more today than we did 50 years ago. And there's sort of this exponential growth. And yet, I'm not sure we're any wiser for it, right? There's so much, there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of issues. And the reality is that wisdom is fundamentally about learning how to live in right relationship with God and with other people and with the world in which we live. I've sometimes, wisdom is very hard to define. In Scripture, you don't really find a clear definition of it. You see examples and descriptions. But one of the images I've tried to use is, the wisdom is really for human beings is learning the art of becoming fully human, as who we are created to be and how we're created to live in the world that we live. And I think, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and so in a business context, what does that look like?
Well, I think a couple things. One is that, and I've thought a lot about this, as the book suggests, about leadership, in particular in businesses. I think in business, sometimes I started my own company. I know you started your own publishing company, and so as an entrepreneur, a lot of it falls on you, right? I mean, I remember early on in my business thinking, if I don't do something today, nothing's going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. Because I'm the one. I'm sure you've had that sort of experience.
Sure.
And I think we live in an American individualistic culture where leadership tends to be focused on the individual. And I think one of the things we learn from a biblical understanding of wisdom and of who God is that God, in his very being, is a person in community, right? That we as Christians believe in the Trinity. That means we understand that somehow deep embedded into who God is that these are persons in relationship. And I think that has implications for us in how we run our businesses and how we think about leadership. To put it sort of really succinctly, leadership is a team sport. We tend to think of it as an individual sport. At least I've grown up much of my life thinking, my job is to be the leader, the guy, or for women, the woman who is trying to lead a team or an organization. But I think biblical wisdom suggests that we think about that there is wisdom inherent in the community that you are leading. And that part of your challenge is to not just be the one with all the answers or all the wisdom, quote unquote, or all the insight, but to tap into the wisdom that's there in the community. And so I think learning to engage the people who are in our communities, the folks that we're leading. So it was really important to me. I spent a lot of time in my business trying to gather folks around me who added wisdom to my own wisdom, whatever it was that I was bringing to the table. I think that the other aspect of it is that an interesting insight I heard from an Old Testament scholar is that, when God created human beings, male and female, there's in Genesis 2, it talks about how God created someone who is a suitable help to the man, the male, to female to the male. What's interesting in that Hebrew word, the Hebrew scholar said, he translated it, it was someone who is like but opposite, which is really interesting to me, that there's someone who is like in the sense that it is, shares similar purpose, direction, values, but was opposite, was different fundamentally in some way. Now, I have to admit, in my business, I tend to be an idea guy, a strategy guy, so I tend to attract other people who are idea and strategy people to my inner circle. And I have to work hard to look for those who are different from me, who bring a different voice and a different perspective. And again, I think it's easy to look for people who are like us, but not so easy to look for people who are opposite of us.
Yeah. Yeah. When John the Baptist, it reminds me of when John the Baptist said, he must increase, I must decrease. And I find, be curious to know your thoughts on this in your experience, that Jesus often increases through other people.
Yes.
And so but what, especially entrepreneurs, where, you described, if I don't do something today, nothing's going to happen. That basically is, I must increase, he must decrease. And, I've got to do more, I've got to perform more. And in the process, we are putting a lid on the organization, putting a lid on people, and not allowing them to contribute and bring their perspective.
Right. No, I couldn't agree more. I think that fundamentally our job is to not be the cork in the bottle. Someone has said that oftentimes leaders become like corks in the bottle, right? That everything has to go through them. And if it doesn't go through them, then nothing happens. And I think great leaders I've seen have empower others and are willing to take the risk, right, to allow them to increase, to use your language, John the Baptist language, even at the decreasing of their own sort of status or role in a particular situation.
Right.
That's well said.
Yeah. And so many of those important conversations that you have around a board table, some of the best wisdom I've heard is the leader just needs to stay silent. If the leader needs to speak, it should be last.
Yeah.
Not first, to really sort of, bias the conversation, but wait until everybody else has had an opportunity to increase, because Jesus is increasing as we decide that, I don't know everything. And I'm certainly not going to be the one to step up and take ownership and have to physically do all of these things that we're agreeing to as a team. I've got to let everybody else take ownership, and then, speak last if necessary.
No, that's right. And I think another aspect too is, you think of in my book, I talk about the image of Pentecost as being an example of how wisdom is not just communal, but it falls on a diverse group of human beings, right? It's interesting, like you say, that in my board context, one of the challenges is for me as board chair is to make sure everyone is heard from. And that, at Pentecost, this Holy Spirit didn't just fall on Peter, didn't just fall on the 12 apostles, it fell on the whole gathered community. And I think one of the implications of that act is that God has given himself to the whole community, and there's wisdom. I think that's the root of where Paul gets this language of the body of Christ, that everybody matters, right? And all the least we hold them in highest honor because they're actually more important than some of us who think we're so important because we are leaders or whatever. And so I think practically what that means is we need to work hard at cultivating folks and cultivating other voices.
Yeah. And that was a great point you made about how leadership is often reduced to the individual. And I think that's what's happening when we assume that wisdom is only something that can be revealed through the leader. We're not going to listen to everybody else. We're not going to, our perspective is not in a way that we can see wisdom arising through the entire group, that it's got to come sort of through the man on the mountain,
Yes, right.
the Moses up on the mountaintop.
Yeah.
And hey, there was a time when God sort of chose to operate that way. You could argue, at the same time, Moses' disposition was, well, Jethro calls him out and he's like, you're going to wear yourself out trying to be the judge of everything.
Right.
You better start delegating some of this authority.
There's a wonderful story in the Old Testament about when the Spirit falls on the larger community, and I don't know if it was Joshua or someone said, Moses, stop them, right? And he said, no.
Yeah, Moses said, all prophesy. Yeah,
I wish all of God's people were prophets, and that's actually what happened at Pentecost, right?
Yes.
So that's actually the fulfillment, that God's intention is for all human beings to be His image bearers, male and female, in all contexts of life. Anyway, let me tell just one other story that's interesting related to that is, I think in my board experience, and this goes to, we tend to not only just think we are the man on the mountain, but we tend to listen to others who are like us. And one of the things I had observed in my board experience is that there were a number of folks, board members, women in particular, who tended to be quieter and didn't contribute as much. And so I actually sat down with one of the senior women who'd served on major for-profit boards around the country. And I sat down with her over lunch and I said, hey, tell me, how can I engage folks more? And she said to me something that was startling. She said, when you want my opinion on something, ask me. Sort of an obvious thing, right? And secondly, and when you hear something that you agree with, say so. I said, really? And she said, you would be surprised, and this is from her long experience on corporate boards. She said, you'd be surprised how many men agree with other men, but not with other women. And I have to admit, and this is my true confessions time, Darren, that I realized I did that more often than I thought. That when somebody, and I think we tend to agree with folks who are like us, right? That we recognize ourselves in them. And so a couple of things I said to her, I said, that was really helpful. And I started a practice in our board meetings at the very end of just going around the circle, asking everyone if they had, this is one way of doing it, of if they had something they wanted to say but didn't have a chance to say. And so that gave everyone a chance to give voice. And I tried to consciously affirm those, particularly women, and actually it's not just women, it's people who come from cultures that are not so North American in nature, right? North American culture values, and it's not a bad thing, values individual expression, being confident and so on. That's not a bad thing. But there are other cultures that sort of value deference and respect for other people, listening to them and being slow to speak rather than being quick to speak. And I think part of my job as a leader, as a wise leader, is to create space. We talk a lot about today in the wider culture about diversity and equity, inclusion, things like that, where we're trying to hear voices that have been silenced. But it's not just giving them a seat at a table. You actually have to consciously work at the culture that invites them into the process rather than just saying, well, you're here now, speak up if you want to.
Yeah. And, and this all sounds good in theory, but, as it's been said, we don't rise to the level of our goals or our aspirations. We fall to the level of our systems. And so while we could model this in I think a marketplace, workplace context in our churches, it is the man on the mountain model, right? Like when we show up on Sunday, we're not listening to you know, diversity, plurality of voices. We're listening to one man, generally speaking, preaching 52 times a year, unless, they're doing the pulpit swaps. Um, eh, so, I mean, how, like, this is what's being modeled for us in our churches, that the one guy has the wisdom. Everybody else needs to sit in the pew and not in a circle and listen to what the man of God has to say. So really we're kind of left to those of us in the marketplace to model this, because that train has kind of left the station in terms of what happens on Sunday morning. I mean, I know that we have, there are other church models where we're going to meet in our living room, and it's not going to, I was just talking to a friend of mine that's doing this, where it's not the same person that kind of leads the discussion every week, but they kind of rotate the responsibility for that, more of that New Testament, let everybody bring something when we gather, one person a hymn, a word, a song. So I don't know. That was maybe more than we intended to talk about in this conversation, but here we are.
No, that's good. No, I mean, it's all one fabric, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I think we're shaped by what we learn, right? And I think we have learned, for better, for worse. And it is true that there are people with gifts, right? Some people have the gift of teaching and so on. But I think I agree with you that I think the model that we have experienced mostly in our setting is that there's the wise person up front who teaches, and we're all here just taking notes and working at this stuff. And I think it is interesting. You're right that business, in that sense, in some ways, is ahead of the church in terms of implementing a model of leadership and of wisdom that is much more communal.
And discipleship.
Not all business, yeah, and
especially.
discipleship. I think that's right, and actually, that's a good thing. And I think that's that can. I mean, I think sometimes the church has wisdom to offer to the world. Sometimes the world has wisdom to offer to the church, and I think biblical wisdom actually learns to to discern and learn from both things. So.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to that issue of the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and what that means for us as business people. And it, for me, I tend to link what you were saying earlier about the least of these. You talked about how, your organizations had been taking care of the least of these. And why? Because Jesus says, if you've done it to them, you've done it to me. If you haven't done it to them, you haven't done it to me. And do you believe that Jesus is on the receiving end of everything we do in business?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of asking the question. I think, yes, it can be. He can be. I think God is, God's work that we do in business is not just, maybe another way of asking or answering your question is that the work we do in business is not just a means to something else, right? And that we should be viewing our work in business as an expression of God's mission in the world, and that what we do in the world is meant to offer praise and glory ultimately to God, right? Jesus talks about in his parables about coming as the person coming looking for fruit, right? And fruit isn't just the fruit of our personal lives, but the work that we've done, right? How we treated the world, how we treated other people in the world. And he found in his day, as probably he would in our day, there are some who are doing good work and some who are not doing such good work. And it's interesting to me that his acid test, which shows up in the Matthew passage about the final judgment, is how you treat those on the margins is the real test of whether we're being faithful or not.
Mm.
And that's interesting to me. I don't know that's the only test, but it's interesting that he picked that right, as an indicator. So I think in that sense, you're right. It's all, you've done this for me. You're not just doing this for this person, not just doing this for this work. You're doing this for me, whether you realize it or not, right?
Yeah.
This is an offering. What kind of offering is this going to be, right?
Right. Because, there would be, at least as I understand it, would be sort of gradations of the least of these, because in some sense, we're all kind of the least of these in different contexts. And so, the way that I treat my employee is exactly the way I'm treating Jesus. The way I treat my customer is exactly the way I'm treating Jesus. The way that I present my my tax or financial reporting, and whoever I'm presenting that to, I'm presenting it to Jesus. But somehow I think we lose the fear of the Lord when we sort of compartmentalize and say, well, I'm only relating to Jesus in this if this is like a poor person, or this is like somebody that is really, really marginalized in society. But no, it's from him and to him and through him are all things. So he's not just the source of wisdom, he's also on the receiving end of the wisdom or the lack of wisdom, however, whatever the case may be. And I mean, that just puts the fear of the Lord in me. Like when I think about, my interaction with whoever I'm going to interact with in business, is in how I relate to that person and how I treat that person is exactly the way I'm treating Jesus. There's no more sacred secular divide. It's all spiritual at that point.
Yeah, right. No, that's well said. Every human being is made in the image of God. And how you treat the image is how you treat God, right? So no, I think you're right. Exactly right.
And so people can get the book, The Wise Leader, at dupree.org/books/wise leader. We'll have the links to all of this in the show notes. What else do you want to say about how this book is going to bless our listeners?
Well, I think I should leave that to your listeners to decide, but I think I'm hopeful. I wrote this. My hope is that it will bless old and young alike. I think in many ways, I was writing it for those who are younger and physically younger and are earlier in their careers. So I hope folks who are on the journey of learning to become wise leaders will find the book helpful in terms of offering biblical reflections and how to integrate their faith in their work. And I think for those of us at my stage in life, I'm 70, and I'm now thinking about what the legacy of my life will be. And I think my hope is the book actually in some ways models thoughtful reflection about, and everybody has a story to tell. I don't claim to have in any sense all the wisdom on this. I hope I have some things that are helpful, but I think it might help those who are perhaps even older who are thinking about how do you pass on, what is the meaning of your life, and how will you pass on a biblical legacy to those who follow you. So I hope that's helpful to them.
Yes, well said. Well, we thank you for spending some time with me and with our listeners today, and helping us think and helping us grow. We're all better for it.
It's a joy to be with you, Darren, and bless you and your work, and bless all those who are listening to this.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if so, we would greatly appreciate it if you'd leave us a quick rating and review for the Christianity in Business podcast on iTunes. You can get more information about HCU's Center for Christianity in Business and sign up to receive free access to all issues of the Christian Business Review Journal by visiting our website at christianityinbusiness.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep integrating biblical values into your business.